Welcome to episode 2 of our Bicep Series. This episode is all about Azure Bicep fundamentals, the modules, iterations, variables, parameters, and all those tips and tricks that will help us to build amazing bicep files in future. We're going to create two storage accounts, one in West Europe and one in South Africa North. The storage account in South Africa will be added to an existing resource group. We'll create a new resource group for West Europe. Each storage account will have 3 containers to store different types of pictures. For production, we're going to use hot storage, and for non-prod, we're going to use cold storage. And in the whole process, we're going to introduce the bicep fundamentals, the tips and tricks to make sure that we build amazing bicep files in future. In this episode, we created a storage account and a container, and we had a bicep file that looked something like this. We had parameters, declared a storage account, and created a container, and we used Azure CLI to deploy the storage account into a resource group. For this episode, we're going to take the same concept, create storage account, create multiple containers, but we'll do so by adding the tips and tricks that I spoke about earlier. So we're going to create a file called main.bicep. This is where we're going to run from. I'm going to create another one, call it storage.bicep. And the last one, we'll call it container.bicep. That's where we're going to have our container code. Let's crack into it. Now that our bicep file is ready, we're going to go through a couple of sections that are worth mentioning. First, parameters. We have environment, which doesn't have a default value, which means we have to supply a value whenever we deploy. We have instance, which has a minimum length of 1, maximum length of 3, and we also supplied description. We also have a storage SKU with a default value. However, should we decide to supply a value for storage SKU, these are the only values that are allowed, which is quite cool. We then have our variables with the names, and we'll use that as we get into the module section. We have our target scope as subscription, which means the resource groups that we defined here will be deployed into the subscription. We have 2 ways of defining our resource groups. In this case, we're not creating a new one, but we're using the existing resource group, which means the resource group must be there for this file to be successful. On the second one, we are creating a new resource group from scratch. Now into the exciting part, the modules. We have 2 storage accounts, and both of them are using the storage.bicep file, which we'll get into just now. Now, when we define a module, you start off with a keyword module, followed by the symbolic name or the identifier, then the file that you're going to use. In this case, you also have a name and the parameters that the storage.bicep file expects. Now, let's jump into storage.bicep. We have the parameters that we saw in the main.bicep. And then we define a storage account using the API as we spoke about in our first episode. We give it a name and all the necessary parameters or properties. We then create a container. But creating a container, we're also using container.bicep module. And not only that, we're introducing the iteration. So we're saying for each and every name that we have in container names, create a container. So going back to our variables, we have a variable called container names, which has 3 names, which basically then means for each and every name in container names, we will have about 3 containers. And a container.bicep is a very simple one. All it does is just create a container with this name. We are now ready to deploy our file. Now, before we do that, let's go into Azure portal and quickly check how many resource groups we have. We have 0. Go back. Let's check how many storage accounts we have. We've got no storage groups. Now, going back to resource groups, we need to create a resource group. And the reason for that is in our bicep file, we did say we want to use existing resource group. So if you don't find it, a bicep file will fail. Now let's go in and create one. Our resource group, we're going to call it rgza stock file dash prod. So rgza is our symbol name, app is stock file dash environment we're going to deploy to prod. So that's perfect. We're going to deploy it to South Africa North, create a resource rgza stock file prod. That's perfect. Now coming back to the code, going to deploy to West Europe, and then main.bicep is our file. Let's go. Should ask me for environment. Let's say prod. We'll validate in the background and it should start running just now. Let's see. There we go. Now, after a couple of seconds, our deployment is successful. Right, let's go back to the portal to see what really happened there. Going back to our resource group, we created only one, which is ZA stock file. The new one was created, which is EU stock file prod. And inside there, we have resources. We have a storage account. It's prod. And if I go into the storage account, then containers, you'll see that we have 3 containers here. Remember, we are in storage, EU stock file prod, and the instance. Going into the overview, you'll realize that the access tier is hot. If we had anything other than prod as an environment, this would be cool. That shows the conditions. Going back to the ZA stock for prod, we have a storage account, and then inside the storage account we should have 3 containers, and our storage account should be hot, which it is. Perfect, which means our deployment worked. We have reached the end of our exercise. What have we learned today? We learned something about parameters, variables, scope, conditions. So in this case, if the environment is prod, set it to hot. If not, keep it cool. We learned something about modules, how to reuse the same bicep file to create 2 storage accounts. We also learned something about iterations. We managed to create 3 containers using this code, also referencing this container.bicep file. That's it. Thank you. Welcome to ask questions, comment, subscribe, and let's have a conversation.